He wasn't supposed to be in that courtroom. Not as a lawyer. Not in a suit. Not with a bar certificate in his hand. 5 years earlier, he'd been standing in a prison jumpsuit, hands chained, head bowed, wrongly convicted by the very judge now sitting smugly on the bench. Judge Harrington. The man who stole his future. The man who sent dozens behind bars, some innocent, some framed, all helpless. But today was different. Today he walked back into that same courtroom, not as a victim, but as an attorney. Quiet, calm, prepared. Everyone turned when he stepped forward to represent a terrified young man accused of a crime he didn't commit. Judge Harrington's smile faltered. "You?" he muttered. "You think you can practice law in my courtroom?" The lawyer set his papers down, met the judge's eyes, and said, "I didn't study law for a career. I studied law to expose men like you." The room froze. Then came the evidence. Documents, recordings, cases overturned by bribes, falsified testimonies, signatures traced back to the judge's private office. Every secret Harrington buried for 20 years came out one by one. By the time he finished, the courtroom wasn't breathing. And when the final piece of evidence hit the judge's desk, a confession from a former clerk, Harrington's face turned white. The man he once sentenced was now the man who would take everything from him. And the innocent client? He walked free, because justice, for the first time in that courtroom, finally belonged to the right person. Stay with me until the end, because what he uncovered after that trial didn't just expose one corrupt judge, it shook the entire justice system. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now, let's get started. The story begins with Marcus Thompson, a 22-year-old engineering student at State University. He was studying late one Thursday night when his entire world collapsed. The police burst through his dorm room door at 2 a.m, shouting commands, flashing badges, and pointing weapons directly at his chest. "Marcus Thompson, you're under arrest for armed robbery and assault." Marcus couldn't breathe. He'd never committed a crime in his life. He'd spent that entire evening in the library working on his final project. Dozens of students had seen him there. The security cameras would prove his innocence, but none of that mattered. Within hours, he found himself sitting across from a public defender who barely looked up from his paperwork. The man spoke in monotone sentences, explaining that the evidence against Marcus was overwhelming. A witness had identified him. His fingerprints were allegedly found at the scene. The case was open and shut. "But I wasn't there," Marcus insisted. "I was studying. There are witnesses. There are cameras." The public defender shrugged. "That's what they all say, kid. Judge Harrington doesn't like wasting time. He runs a tight courtroom. My advice? Take the plea deal. 5 years instead of 15. Marcus felt his stomach drop. 5 years for something he didn't do. But what choice did he have? His family couldn't afford a real lawyer. His parents worked 2 jobs each just to keep him in school. The system was supposed to protect him, but it felt like everyone had already decided he was guilty. The trial lasted exactly 3 days. Judge Harrington presided with an iron fist, cutting off Marcus's attorney every time he tried to present evidence of his client's innocence. The security footage from the library mysteriously disappeared. The witnesses who could verify Marcus's alibi were never called to testify. "Objection, Your Honor," his attorney would say weakly. "Overruled," Harrington would snap back without even looking up. The prosecution painted Marcus as a dangerous criminal who needed to be removed from society. They claimed he'd robbed a convenience store at gunpoint, severely injuring the elderly clerk. The witness, a nervous man in his 30s, pointed directly at Marcus and said, "That's him. I'll never forget his face." Marcus's heart pounded as he listened to lie after lie. Nothing made sense. The description of the robber was completely different from his appearance. The timeline didn't match. Even the weapon allegedly used was a type of gun he'd never seen before in his life. But Judge Harrington seemed uninterested in these details. He rushed through objections, dismissed evidence requests, and treated the defense like an inconvenience. When the jury returned after less than 2 hours of deliberation, Marcus knew his fate was sealed. Guilty on all charges. The gavel came down like thunder. 15 years in state prison. Marcus's mother collapsed in the gallery, sobbing uncontrollably. His father sat in stunned silence, unable to process what had just happened to their son. As the bailiffs approached with handcuffs, Marcus caught Judge Harrington's eye. The man was smiling, not the professional smile of a judge delivering justice, but something colder. Something that suggested this outcome had been decided long before the trial even began. Prison was everything Marcus had feared and worse. He was surrounded by hardened criminals, violent men who saw his youth and education as weaknesses to exploit. He spent his first month in solitary confinement after 3 separate attacks. The guards seemed indifferent to his safety, treating him like just another number in the system. But something unexpected happened during those long, dark hours alone in his cell. Instead of breaking, Marcus began to think. He replayed every moment of his trial, analyzing each decision his attorney made, each ruling from the judge, each piece of evidence that was ignored or dismissed. The more he thought about it, the more patterns he began to see. His case wasn't just mishandled, it was deliberately sabotaged. Someone had wanted him in prison, and they'd made sure. He ended up there regardless of the truth. Late at night, when the prison was quiet except for the distant sounds of men who'd given up hope, Marcus made a decision that would change everything. He would study law, not to become a lawyer in the traditional sense, but to understand exactly how the system had failed him. More importantly, he would learn how to make sure it never happened to anyone else. The prison library became his second home. While other inmates spent their time in the yard or watching television, Marcus buried himself in legal textbooks, case studies, and court records. The librarian, an older woman named Mrs. Patterson, took pity on him and began ordering specialized books on his request. "Why are you doing this to yourself?" she asked one afternoon, as Marcus sat surrounded by stacks of constitutional law books. "You're just making your time here harder." Marcus looked up from his notes, his eyes clearer and more determined than they'd been since his arrest. "Because I'm going to prove my innocence. And then I'm going to make sure Judge Harrington never destroys another life." It sounded impossible. A convicted felon with no money, no connections, and no formal legal training, taking on a powerful judge with decades of experience. But Marcus had something Harrington didn't expect. Time, patience, and an absolutely unshakable belief that the truth would eventually surface. He began reaching out to other inmates, quietly asking about their cases, their trials, their experiences with Judge Harrington. What he discovered made his blood run cold. Story after story of rushed trials, dismissed evidence, and convenient disappearances of witnesses. Men who swore they were innocent, sitting in cells because the same judge had railroaded them through the system. The pattern was undeniable. Judge Harrington wasn't just incompetent. He was corrupt, and Marcus was going to prove it. Marcus spent 3 years building his case from inside those concrete walls. Every conversation with fellow inmates revealed another piece of the puzzle. Every legal document he studied showed him exactly how Harrington manipulated the system. But knowledge alone wasn't enough. He needed proof that would hold up in court. That proof came from an unexpected source. Tommy Williams, a lifer serving time for murder, pulled Marcus aside one evening in the cafeteria. Tommy had been watching Marcus for months, impressed by his dedication to studying law while everyone else had given up hope. "You really think you can take down that judge?" Tommy asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Marcus nodded. "I know I can. I just need evidence that can't be ignored." Tommy glanced around nervously, then leaned closer. "My trial was 5 years ago. Same judge, same rushed proceedings. But here's what you don't know. My brother worked as a janitor in the courthouse back then. He used to empty the trash in Harrington's chambers every night." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. What did he find? Documents. Lots of them. Communications with prosecutors. Lists of cases with predetermined outcomes. My brother kept copies of everything, thinking maybe someday they'd be worth something. When I got convicted, he tried to bring them to my lawyer, but the man wouldn't even look at them. Tommy reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of paper with an address scribbled on it. My brother still has those documents, all of them, hidden in his basement for 5 years, waiting for someone who actually gives a damn about justice. Marcus stared at the address, his hands trembling slightly. This was it, the breakthrough he'd been praying for. But there was one massive problem. He was still in prison with 12 years left on his sentence. Those documents wouldn't help him if he couldn't access them. That night, Marcus made another decision that would define the rest of his life. He began preparing for something that seemed impossible. He would represent himself in an appeal, not just any appeal, but one that would expose everything he'd discovered about Judge Harrington's corruption. The legal system allows prisoners to file appeals, but it's designed to discourage them. The process is complicated, expensive, and stacked against anyone without formal legal training. Most inmates who try to represent themselves fail miserably, their cases dismissed on technicalities before they ever reach a courtroom. But Marcus wasn't most inmates. He'd spent 3 years studying every aspect of appellate law. He knew the rules better than some practicing attorneys. More importantly, he understood something that his original public defender never grasped. This wasn't just about proving his innocence anymore. This was about exposing a systematic pattern of corruption that had destroyed countless lives. He began drafting his appeal with meticulous precision. Every argument was supported by case law. Every claim was backed by evidence he could prove. But the most crucial element was something no one expected. Marcus requested that his appeal be heard by a different judge in a different district, citing potential bias and conflict of interest. The request was initially denied. The court system protects its own, and questioning a sitting judge's integrity is not taken lightly. But Marcus had anticipated this. He filed motion after motion, each one more detailed than the last, slowly building a case that became impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, he reached out to Tommy's brother through carefully worded letters that passed prison inspection. The man, whose name was David Williams, was initially skeptical. He'd been burned before by lawyers who promised justice but delivered nothing. But something about Marcus's letters convinced him this time was different. David began photographing the documents he'd hidden years earlier. Bank records showing unusual deposits into accounts linked to court personnel. Transcripts of phone conversations between Judge Harrington and prosecutors discussing case outcomes before trials even began. Most damning of all, handwritten notes in Harrington's own writing, detailing which defendants needed to be convicted, regardless of evidence. The photographs were smuggled into the prison through a network Marcus had never known existed. Inmates have their own communication systems, their own ways of moving information when the official channels fail them. Within weeks, Marcus had copies of everything David had preserved. What he found exceeded his worst fears. Judge Harrington wasn't just corrupt. He was running what amounted to a conviction factory. Innocent people were being systematically railroaded through his courtroom to maintain his reputation as a tough-on-crime judge. Politicians loved his conviction rate. The media praised his efficiency. Meanwhile, dozens of innocent men and women rotted in prison cells. Marcus's own case was just one entry in Harrington's ledger of destroyed lives. The witness who identified him had been coached. The fingerprint evidence had been fabricated. Even the convenience store robbery itself was suspicious, with inconsistencies in the police report that should have raised red flags. But Marcus discovered something even more disturbing. The robbery had actually been committed by the son of a prominent local businessman. When the young man was arrested, his father made a phone call to Judge Harrington. Within hours, the charges were dropped and a new suspect was needed. Marcus, a poor college student with no connections and no ability to fight back, became the perfect scapegoat. Armed with this evidence, Marcus refined his appeal into something unprecedented. He wasn't just challenging his own conviction anymore. He was challenging the entire system that allowed Judge Harrington to operate with impunity. The document he submitted was over 200 pages long, meticulously researched, and absolutely devastating. The appeal landed on the desk of Judge Patricia Morrison, a federal judge known for her integrity and attention to detail. When she began reading Marcus's submission, she expected to find the typical desperate claims of an imprisoned man grasping for freedom. Instead, she found a carefully constructed legal argument that made her blood run cold. Judge Morrison had been on the bench for 15 years. She'd seen corruption before, but never on this scale. The evidence Marcus presented painted a picture of systematic judicial misconduct that went far beyond a few bad decisions. This was organized crime wearing a judge's robe. She immediately ordered an investigation. Federal agents descended on Judge Harrington's courthouse like a storm. They seized computers, searched offices, and interviewed staff members who had remained silent for years out of fear. The investigation expanded rapidly as more victims came forward, encouraged by news reports that someone was finally listening. Meanwhile, Marcus waited in his cell, knowing that his life hung in the balance. If his appeal failed, he would spend the next 12 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. But if it succeeded, he wouldn't just win his freedom. He would expose a corruption scandal that would send shockwaves through the entire justice system. The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in federal court. Marcus had requested permission to represent himself, a request that was granted despite strong objections from the prosecutor's office. They knew what he'd uncovered, and they were terrified of what he might reveal in open court. On the morning of the hearing, Marcus put on the only suit he owned, a cheap outfit his mother had bought him years earlier for his original trial. As he walked into the courtroom, he felt the weight of every innocent person Judge Harrington had wrongfully convicted. This wasn't just about his freedom anymore. This was about justice for everyone who had been forgotten by the system. Judge Morrison took her seat, looked directly at Marcus, and said the words that would change everything. "Mr. Thompson, I've reviewed your submission. This court is prepared to hear your arguments. You may proceed. Proceed." Marcus stood at the podium, his heart hammering against his ribs, but his voice steady as steel. He'd practiced this moment 1,000 times in his cell, but nothing could have prepared him for the weight of actually being here. Your Honor, 5 years ago, I walked into Judge Harrington's courtroom as an innocent man. I walked out as a convicted felon, sentenced to 15 years for a crime I did not commit. Today, I stand before this court not just seeking my own freedom, but seeking justice for every person whose life has been destroyed by systematic corruption. Judge Morrison leaned forward, her expression grave. The gallery behind Marcus was packed with reporters, legal observers, and family members of other victims who had finally found hope. Marcus opened his first folder. The evidence I'm about to present will show that Judge Harrington has been operating a conviction mill for over 2 decades. Innocent people have been systematically railroaded through his courtroom to maintain his political reputation and financial interests. He placed the first document on the evidence table, a bank record showing deposits into an account linked to Harrington's wife, made just days after controversial convictions. This deposit of $50,000 was made 3 days after Judge Harrington convicted Maria Santos, a single mother, of drug trafficking. The evidence against Mrs. Santos was circumstantial at best. The key witness later recanted his testimony, claiming he was coerced by prosecutors. Mrs. Santos has served 4 years of a 10-year sentence. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Judge Morrison examined the document, her face growing darker with each detail. Marcus continued methodically, each piece of evidence building upon the last. Phone records showing calls between Harrington and prosecutors before trials, transcripts of conversations where case outcomes were discussed as if they were business transactions rather than matters of justice. Your Honor, this recording was made by courthouse staff member Janet Crawford, who became suspicious of unusual activity in Judge Harrington's chambers. The audio played through the courtroom speakers. Harrington's voice was unmistakable as he discussed with a prosecutor how to ensure a conviction in a case where the evidence was weak. "We need this one to stick, Michael. The mayor's breathing down my neck about crime statistics. Find a way to make the evidence work." "But Judge, the alibi witnesses are solid. The defendant was at work when the robbery occurred." "Then discredit the witnesses. Question their credibility. Do whatever it takes." The recording sent shockwaves through the gallery. Several people gasped audibly. Judge Morrison's knuckles were white as she gripped her gavel. Marcus pressed forward. "This pattern of corruption extends far beyond my own case. I've identified 37 defendants who were wrongfully convicted in Judge Harrington's courtroom over the past 8 years. Each case follows the same pattern: rushed proceedings, dismissed evidence, convenient disappearances of exculpatory witnesses." He presented a chart he'd meticulously created during his years in prison. Names, dates, case numbers, and conviction details. The scope of the corruption was staggering. James Rodriguez, convicted of assault despite video evidence showing he was in another state at the time of the crime. Sarah Mitchell, sentenced to 12 years for embezzlement based on falsified financial records. David Chen, found guilty of arson when the fire was later determined to be caused by faulty electrical wiring. Each name represented a destroyed life. Each case represented a failure of the system that was supposed to protect the innocent. Judge Morrison interrupted. "Mr. Thompson, these are serious allegations. Do you have documentation supporting each of these claims?" Marcus smiled grimly. "Yes, Your Honor. Every single one." He spent the next 2 hours presenting evidence that painted a picture of corruption so extensive it seemed almost impossible to believe. Bank records, altered court documents, witness statements describing intimidation and coercion. The paper trail was undeniable, But the most devastating evidence came at the end. Marcus pulled out a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. This journal belonged to Judge Harrington's former clerk, Michael Patterson, who died in a car accident 2 years ago. Before his death, Mr. Patterson gave this journal to his sister, expressing fears for his safety if its contents became public. Marcus opened to a page marked with a red tab. Entry dated March 15th, 3 years ago. Quote, Judge Harrington instructed me to alter the court transcript in the Williams case. The defendant's alibi testimony is to be removed entirely. When I protested, he threatened to have me charged with contempt and disbarred. I have no choice but to comply, but I cannot continue to be part of this corruption. I fear what will happen if I speak out, but I cannot remain silent forever. End quote. The courtroom was dead silent. Judge Morrison's face had gone pale as she absorbed the implications of what she was hearing. Marcus continued reading entries that detailed years of judicial misconduct, evidence tampering, witness intimidation, financial kickbacks, and case fixing. The journal read like a handbook for judicial corruption. Your Honor, Michael Patterson documented every illegal act he was forced to participate in. His sister, Linda Patterson, will testify that her brother lived in constant fear during his final months, convinced that Judge Harrington would have him killed to protect these secrets. The prosecutor, who had remained silent throughout Marcus's presentation, finally stood. Your Honor, these allegations are based on hearsay and the ravings of a convicted felon desperate for freedom. There's no credible evidence of the systematic corruption Mr. Thompson describes. Marcus turned to face the prosecutor, his eyes blazing. No credible evidence? I've presented bank records, audio recordings, official court documents, and the detailed journal of a court officer. What more evidence do you need? Judge Morrison raised her hand. Mr. Thompson, I need to ask you directly. How did you obtain all of this evidence while incarcerated? Marcus had expected this question. Your Honor, I had help from people who witnessed this corruption firsthand, but were too afraid to speak out while Judge Harrington held power. Prison inmates, former court employees, family members of victims. They trusted me with this evidence because they knew I had nothing left to lose and everything to gain by exposing the truth. He gestured toward the gallery. Many of those people are here today. They're prepared to testify about what they witnessed, what they were forced to do, and how Judge Harrington's corruption destroyed their lives and the lives of their loved ones. Judge Morrison looked out at the packed courtroom. She could see the faces of people who had been waiting years for this moment. Parents whose children had been wrongfully imprisoned. Spouses whose partners had been torn away by false convictions. Former court employees whose careers had been destroyed for refusing to participate in corruption. Mr. Thompson, what remedy are you seeking from this court? Marcus straightened his shoulders. Your Honor, I'm seeking the immediate vacation of my conviction and the convictions of every person wrongfully sentenced by Judge Harrington. I'm seeking a federal investigation into the entire judicial district. Most importantly, I'm seeking to ensure that no other innocent person suffers what I and dozens of others have endured. The words hung in the air like a challenge to the entire justice system. Marcus had spent 5 years preparing for this moment, and now everything depended on whether Judge Morrison would have the courage to act on what she'd heard. Judge Morrison closed the folder in front of her and looked directly at Marcus. Mr. Thompson, in my 15 years on the federal bench, I have never encountered such extensive documentation of judicial corruption. The evidence you've presented is not just compelling, it's overwhelming. She paused, the weight of her next words evident in her expression. This court finds that your conviction was obtained through prosecutorial misconduct and judicial corruption. Your conviction is hereby vacated, and you are ordered released immediately. The gallery erupted. Marcus felt his knees buckle as the reality hit him. After 5 years in prison, he was finally free. But Judge Morrison wasn't finished. Furthermore, this court is ordering an immediate federal investigation into all cases handled by Judge Harrington over the past 20 years. The evidence presented today suggests a pattern of corruption that demands the full attention of federal law enforcement. She turned to the prosecutor. I'm also ordering the district attorney's office to review every conviction obtained in Judge Harrington's courtroom and to provide this court with a plan for addressing potential wrongful convictions within 30 days. Marcus was led out of the courtroom as a free man for the first time in 5 years, but his fight was just beginning. The evidence he'd uncovered would lead to one of the largest judicial corruption scandals in American history. Within hours, federal agents were executing search warrants across the district. Judge Harrington's offices were sealed. His bank accounts were frozen. Former court employees who had remained silent for years suddenly found the courage to come forward with their own evidence of corruption. The investigation that followed would eventually lead to the overturning of over 60 wrongful convictions. Judge Harrington would be arrested, tried, and sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. The district attorney who had participated in the corruption would resign in disgrace and face his own criminal charges. But Marcus Thompson's story was far from over. His experience had transformed him from a wrongfully convicted prisoner into something the corrupt system never expected. A lawyer with nothing to lose and everything to fight for. 3 months after his release, Marcus walked into a different courthouse in a different city. This time, he wore a proper suit and carried a briefcase filled with evidence of another corrupt judge in another district. Word of his success had spread, and victims of judicial corruption from across the country were reaching out, begging for his help. The young man sitting at the defendant's table looked exactly as Marcus had 5 years earlier. Terrified, confused, and facing a system that had already decided his fate before the trial even began. Judge Reynolds, the target of Marcus's new investigation, smiled condescendingly as Marcus approached the bench. "And you are?" Marcus set down his briefcase and looked the judge directly in the eye. "Marcus Thompson, attorney for the defense, and I'm here because I believe my client is innocent." Judge Reynolds' smile faltered slightly. Something in Marcus's tone suggested this wouldn't be an ordinary trial. "Well, Mr. Thompson, I hope you're prepared to present actual evidence rather than conspiracy theories." Marcus opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "Your Honor, I'm prepared to present evidence that will shock this courtroom and expose corruption that has been hidden for far too long." The battle was beginning again. But this time, Marcus wasn't fighting alone. A network of investigators, journalists, and legal advocates had formed around his work. They called themselves the Innocence Coalition, and they were systematically targeting corrupt judges across the nation. Judge Reynolds had no idea what was about to hit him, but he was about to learn the same lesson Judge Harrington had learned the hard way. When an innocent man studies law not for money or prestige, but for justice, he becomes the most dangerous opponent corruption has ever faced. The success of Marcus's first case sent shockwaves through legal circles nationwide. Word traveled fast about the former prisoner who had taken down one of the most powerful judges in the state. But with that fame came danger. Late one evening, as Marcus worked in his cramped office above a diner, his phone rang. The voice on the other end was shaking with fear. Mr. Thompson, my name is Angela Martinez. I heard about what you did to Judge Harrington. I need your help. They're coming for my husband next week. Marcus set down his pen. Slow down. Tell me what's happening. My husband Carlos was arrested 3 months ago for armed robbery, but he was at work that night. His supervisor will testify. The security cameras show him clocking out at 11:30. The robbery happened at midnight 15 miles away. It's impossible. Marcus felt that familiar chill, the same pattern, the same rushed timeline. Who's the judge? Judge Patricia Williams. She's scheduled to hear the case next Tuesday. Mr. Thompson, Carlos has never even gotten a speeding ticket. We have 3 kids. If he goes to prison, we lose everything. Marcus grabbed his calendar. 5 days to prepare. It wasn't enough time, but it would have to be. Mrs. Martinez, I'll take the case, but I need you to understand something. When I walk into that courtroom, I'm not just defending your husband. I'm going to war with everyone who put him there. The next morning, Marcus drove to the courthouse where Judge Williams presided. He sat in the back of her courtroom, watching her handle cases. What he saw made his blood boil. Case after case, rushed proceedings. Defense attorneys who barely spoke. Witnesses dismissed without explanation. Evidence requests denied with a wave of her hand. Judge Williams ran her courtroom like Harrington had run his, efficiently, ruthlessly, without regard for truth. During a brief recess, Marcus approached one of the public defenders in the hallway. "Excuse me, I'm Marcus Thompson. I'm curious about Judge Williams. How long has she been on the bench?" The lawyer looked around nervously. "About 8 years. Listen, if you're planning to practice in her courtroom, here's some free advice. Don't fight her rulings. Don't ask for continuances. Don't present more evidence than she wants to hear. She likes quick resolutions." Marcus nodded slowly. "And if the defendant is actually innocent?" The public defender laughed bitterly. "Then you better hope someone else is available to hear the case." That afternoon, Marcus began his investigation. He visited Carlos Martinez at the county jail. The man was exactly what his wife had described. Soft-spoken, terrified, and completely bewildered by what was happening to him. "I keep trying to tell them I was at work," Carlos said, his voice breaking. "My supervisor, Mr. Johnson, he already said he'd testify for me. The security guard remembers me leaving. There are cameras everywhere at the warehouse. How can they ignore all of that?" Marcus leaned forward. "Carlos, I need you to think carefully. Have you ever had any interaction with Judge Williams before? Any traffic tickets in her court? Any civil matters?" Marcus Thompson's journey from wrongfully convicted prisoner to corruption-fighting attorney proves that sometimes the system's greatest enemy comes from within its own walls. Through 5 years of relentless study and unwavering determination, he didn't just win his freedom. He exposed a network of judicial corruption that had destroyed hundreds of innocent lives. Today, over 60 wrongful convictions have been overturned because one man refused to accept injustice as inevitable. Justice delayed isn't justice denied when someone never stops fighting for the truth.